Ohio, September 1994. 19-year-old Casey Voss had worked the Marchetti place for exactly one season when she found herself standing in a pole barn at 6 in the morning, staring down a ewe lamb everyone else on the crew had already decided needed to be culled before she hurt somebody. And Casey stood there a long moment, the smell of cold straw and damp wool thick in her nose, before she let herself admit why her hands had gone cold and still in a way that had nothing to do with the morning air. The lamb's name, if she'd ever had one worth using, was simply the Mean One by then, a name that had stuck since spring when she'd first started headbutting the fence rails hard enough to split wood, biting at hands that came too close, and once, in June, catching the owner's son across the forearm badly enough to need 4 stitches. Ron Marchetti, who ran 200 head on land his father had worked before him, made the call plainly that same week in June. She goes to the sale barn as cull stock the first chance he got, before she hurt someone worse than a forearm. Casey had been the one who found her that morning in September, 3 days before the sale barn trip was scheduled, and something about the way the lamb was standing, pressed into the far corner, trembling, not lunging the way she did when people got close, just trembling, put Casey right back in a barn on her uncle's place 18 months earlier, standing over a different animal she'd been too new and too unsure of herself to fight hard enough for. That animal had been a heifer calf her uncle called lazy and slow to thrive, dragging behind the rest of the group, uninterested in feed, and Casey, 16 that year and new enough to the operation that she didn't trust her own read on anything yet, had noticed the calf's gums looked pale, had wondered out loud once whether something was actually wrong rather than the calf simply being weak stock, and had let her uncle's flat dismissal, "She's just a poor doer, some of them are," end the conversation instead of pushing the way she now knows, looking back, she should have. The calf died 3 weeks later of what the vet, called too late, said had likely been a treatable parasite load the whole time. Casey had never told anyone how much that particular morning had stayed with her, the exact shape of the thing she hadn't said loud enough when it might have mattered. She wasn't going to let herself be the girl who noticed and stayed quiet a second time. She'd watched this lamb all season, careful in a way she hadn't told anyone about, and noticed things that didn't add up the way mean was supposed to add up. The headbutting only happened when people approached fast, or from behind, or in a group. Alone, slow, from the front, the lamb mostly just watched, wary, the way a spooked animal watches, not the way an aggressive one hunts an opening. And she'd never once, not one single time all season, shown any interest in the rams during breeding season. Not fear of them exactly, just a total blank absence of the behavior every other ewe her age showed without exception. If you've ever stayed quiet once, at a cost you didn't fully understand until later, and swore to yourself you wouldn't make that same mistake twice, I'd genuinely love to hear about it in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from too. I read every one. Now, let's get into it. Casey brought it up to Ron that same morning, careful about how she said it, aware she was 19 and new and talking to a man who'd run this operation longer than she'd been alive, and aware, too, of a tension in Ron that hadn't been there the year before, one the whole crew had noticed since August. A neighboring operation 2 farms over had been sued that summer after a visiting child was bitten badly by a boar that everyone had known was unpredictable and kept anyway, out of the same kind of stubborn attachment Ron didn't have time for. The lawsuit hadn't touched the Marchetti place directly, but Ron had spent 3 separate evenings that August on the phone with his insurance agent, reviewing his own liability coverage, and had come out of those calls quieter and more careful than Casey had ever seen him. "I don't think she's mean, Mr. Marchetti. I think she's scared." Casey kept her voice even, the way she'd learned too late to talk about hard things around her uncle. "She only goes after people who come at her fast or from behind. Never once shown a lick of interest in the rams, not one time all season, and every other ewe her age has by now." Ron didn't look up from the fence post he was resetting, the dull ring of the maul against the driver carrying flat across the cold morning air. "Casey, I appreciate you paying attention. I do. But I spent 3 nights this August finding out exactly what one bad afternoon with one unpredictable animal can cost a place like mine. And I am not interested in finding out the hard way whether scared and safe to keep around turn out to be the same thing. I've got a sale barn trip Thursday, and a lamb that's already cost me a set of stitches and a summer's worth of worry, and after what happened over at the Decker's place, I don't have room left in me for what if. What if there's a reason for it that means something, something that's not just temperament, and something that changes how she'd actually need to be handled going forward? Then I'd want to know what it was, same as you. Ron set the post, tamped the dirt around it, and for the first time that morning looked at her rather than the fence. But I want to be honest with you about something, Casey, since you're being honest with me. I watched a neighbor lose more than he could afford to lose this summer because he kept telling himself an animal everybody else called dangerous was actually fine, right up until it wasn't. And I don't want to be the next version of that story. Whatever's wrong with her, wrong is wrong, and I don't have the luxury of finding out the slow way, not this particular year. She heard underneath that the same fear she recognized from her own chest 3 years before. Not cruelty, just a man who'd been burned close enough to feel the heat of it and didn't trust his own read on risk anymore either. She didn't argue further because arguing wasn't going to buy her more than a day, and a day wasn't enough to actually find anything out. But she didn't let it go. She called the extension office that same afternoon and reached Dr. Elaine Whitfield, a large animal veterinarian who did rounds for half the county's smaller operations, careful and unhurried on the phone in a way that made Casey feel for the first time all week like she wasn't just a 19-year-old making something out of nothing. Tell me everything you've actually observed, not what anybody's decided about her. Every detail. Don't skip anything that seems small. Casey told her all of it. The headbutting only under fast or close approach, the absence of estrus behavior, the fact that no ram had ever shown real interest in her either, the trembling instead of lunging when alone. Dr. Whitfield was quiet a moment on the other end of the line. I want to come look at her myself before Thursday. Can you keep her calm and away from anyone unfamiliar until I get there? I can try. Try hard, Casey. What you're describing might be something specific, and if it's what I think it might be, it's not her fault, and it's not really mean at all. Dr. Whitfield paused a moment. You sound like this matters to you more than a job usually does. Casey hadn't meant to tell her about the heifer calf, but it came out anyway, quieter than she meant to. I didn't push hard enough once before, about a different animal. She died because of it. I don't want to do that again. Then you've got good reason to want to find out properly this time, instead of guessing. Dr. Whitfield left it there, plain and unadorned, and moved on to the next practical question, like a working vet does. Dr. Whitfield came out the following morning, moved slow and quiet around the lamb the way Casey had learned to over the past few days, and spent the better part of an hour just observing before she ever touched her. The only sound in the barn, the soft, wet rustle of straw under 4 shifting hooves, and the occasional low creak of the pole barn's tin roof settling in the cold. I think this ewe is a freemartin, she said finally, once she'd finished a careful physical exam. It's a real, documented condition, not common but not rare enough that a vet who works with enough sheep and cattle doesn't see it eventually. It happens when twin fetuses share blood supply in the womb, and one twin's male. She'd have had a ram-lamb brother in there with her, most likely stillborn or lost early, since I don't see one in your records. Male hormones cross over during development and affect the female twin. The result is a female animal, genetically, that's often infertile and sometimes shows altered behavior. Not aggression in the way people mean when they say a mean streak, but a kind of chronic anxiety, a heightened startle response, especially to fast or unpredictable movement. She looked at Casey. Everything you described to me on the phone fits that exactly. The lack of interest from rams, her own lack of interest in them, the specific pattern of when she reacts and when she doesn't. So she's not dangerous? She's just afraid? She's afraid in a way that can absolutely still hurt someone if people keep handling her the way they have been, fast, from behind, in groups, the exact things that trigger her. Dr. Whitfield was plain about that part. This isn't a story where the diagnosis makes her instantly safe around anybody who wants to walk up and pet her. It's a story where the diagnosis tells you why, and why changes what you do next if anybody's willing to do it differently. Casey brought Ron out to hear it directly from Dr. Whitfield rather than try to relay it herself, and stood back while the two of them talked. "I appreciate you coming out, doctor, and I don't doubt what you're telling me." Ron listened to the whole explanation without interrupting, the particular patience of a man giving real information its due even when it complicated a decision he'd already made. "I've spent this whole summer scared of exactly this kind of decision, doctor. An animal everybody's got a soft reason to keep and a hard reason to worry about. The Deckers thought their boar's temper was just personality, right up until it wasn't personality anymore. It was a lawsuit, and a kid in the hospital, and a neighbor who doesn't speak to them anymore. I don't want to be the next cautionary tale at the co-op." "That's a real fear, Ron, and I'm not going to tell you it isn't." Dr. Whitfield didn't dismiss it. But the Deckers kept an animal whose actual behavior nobody understood or managed differently once they knew it was unpredictable. What Casey's describing isn't that. It's a specific animal with a specific identifiable trigger pattern and a specific person already handling her successfully around that pattern for a week running. That's not hoping it works. That's already working. Casey felt her chance narrowing to this exact moment. What if I did the handling? Slow approach, always from the front, never in a group. I already know how to do it. I've been doing it all week without anybody teaching me, just from watching her close enough to figure it out. If it's just me and whoever needs to be around her learns the same way, does that change the math?" Ron looked at her a long moment. "You're asking to take on an extra animal's care on top of everything else you're already doing for me, for a sheep that'll never earn her feed back in lambs in the 1 year I've got the least appetite in the world for exactly this kind of risk? I'm asking because I don't think never going to be profitable and needs to be culled are automatically the same thing, same as Dr. Whitfield just said about scared and dangerous not being the same thing." Ron held his gaze. "And I'm asking because I already know what it costs to stay quiet about something like this once. I'm not doing that again, Mr. Marchetti, whatever you decide. I'd just rather you decide with the full picture in front of you instead of without me having said everything I had to say." Ron didn't answer right away, and Casey didn't push further. Understanding that she'd said what she had to say, and pushing harder now would only make it about her rather than about the actual decision in front of him. 90 days, he said finally. "You handle her the way you're describing, exactly that. No group approaches, no fast movement, and I'll watch how she does around the rest of the crew when she has to be moved with the flock for shearing in the fall checks. If she's genuinely safer to be around with the right handling, and if it doesn't cost me more in your time than it's worth, I'll keep her on past that. If it doesn't work, or if she puts somebody else in the emergency room in the meantime, we're back to where we started, and I want to apologize for that, because after this summer, I've got other people's safety weighing on me heavier than it used to." "That's fair," Casey said. "That's more than fair." The 90 days that followed were slower and more ordinary than Casey had expected drama to be. No single dramatic breakthrough, just the accumulation of 100 small, careful mornings, the cold bite of the barn air on her hands before sunup, the particular smell of damp wool and feed dust that clung to her jacket by the time she'd finished, approaching from the front, speaking low before she ever got close, letting the ewe choose to close the last few feet of distance herself rather than closing it for her. By the 4th week, the lamb, Casey had started calling her Marigold for no reason she could fully explain except that the name felt like it belonged to something worth naming properly, had stopped trembling at Casey's approach specifically, though she remained wary of anyone else on the crew who moved too fast or came at her from an angle she couldn't see coming. The shearing crew that October moved the whole flock together, the exact test Ron had named, and Marigold, handled by Casey specifically, slow and from the front, moved through the process without a single incident, calmer than 2 of the actually easy-tempered ewes in the same group. Ron came by the barn the week after shearing, watched Marigold graze calm near the fence a while before he said anything. "I'll admit I didn't expect this to hold up past the first bad morning. Figured we'd be back at the sale barn conversation by October at the latest. He was quiet a moment. I've spent this whole year running scared of exactly the kind of animal everybody warns you about after the fact, once it's too late to do anything but clean up the damage. Didn't leave much room in that fear for the idea that a specific person doing a specific kind of patient work could change what the animal actually cost to keep, and change what the risk actually was, not just how I felt about it. He looked at Casey. You told me, back in September, you weren't going to stay quiet about something a second time. Didn't ask you what you meant by that, and I don't need to now, but I want you to know I heard it, and I think it's the actual reason this worked when I expected it not to. I just watched her, Mr. Marchetti. Didn't do anything nobody else could have done. Maybe. Or maybe watching that closely, patient enough to keep doing it every single morning for 90 days without anything to show for it most of those mornings, is the exact kind of thing most people say they could do and then don't when it's this unglamorous and this slow, and when the fear of getting it wrong is sitting right there the whole time, same as it was with me. Ron didn't make more of it than that. She stays. And I'd like you handling the 2 other ewes we've had trouble with this year too, if you're willing, since apparently I've been running short on the one kind of attention that actually solves this particular kind of problem. Have you ever stayed quiet once, at a cost that stayed with you longer than you expected, and found yourself later in almost the same moment again, with a real choice about whether to be that same quiet person twice? I think anyone who's ever carried a regret like that into a second chance knows the diagnosis is rarely the hardest part. The hardest part is trusting yourself enough to say the thing out loud the second time, when the first time cost you enough to make silence feel safer. Marigold lived out the rest of her natural life on the Marchetti place, never bred, never expected to, handled by Casey, and eventually by 2 other crew members Casey trained in the same slow, front-facing, one-at-a-time approach. She never became what most people would call friendly. She remained always an animal who needed her particular fear respected rather than dismissed, but she never hurt anyone again after that September, and the crew stopped calling her the mean one sometime that same fall, without anybody making a formal decision to stop. Casey stayed on at the Marchetti place another 6 years, long enough to become the person Ron called first whenever an animal's behavior didn't add up the easy way, and long enough to teach the same patient method to 2 more hands who came after her, neither of whom ever knew Marigold by anything but the name Casey had given her, or knew about a heifer calf 2 counties over that neither of them had ever met either. The one whose memory had taught Casey, at real cost, exactly what staying quiet actually costs, and exactly what it's worth to stop. This is FarmLore, where we tell the kind of stories the land doesn't let go of easy. If a story like this one stayed with you, there's more of this county's history waiting. They called her dangerous because nobody had looked closely enough to see she was only afraid. It took one 19-year-old carrying a quiet regret from a different animal she hadn't fought hard enough for once to make sure this time turned out differently. 90 ordinary mornings running until the difference held.